Yeah. Good afternoon, well, good morning, or whatever. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Pio D'Emilia. I'm a moderator today for this very important press conference by Mr. Michael Mroczek. I hope Polish is not my main language, I would say very difficult to pronounce. The chairman of the European Business Council in Japan, which means it's the body that unites all the chambers of commerce of Europe in Japan, a very important and representative institution here in Japan. We invited him because, as you know, we are now in a very difficult and delicate situation about the ban that Japan and other countries have imposed on entry in this country with different details and durations and conditions. So this ban is actually affecting a lot of businessmen, foreign residents, permanent residence holders, journalists. So we thought that it was time to ask to a representative of the European community here his thoughts and what could be the possible solution, possible appeals to the Japanese authorities to reconsider this ban and to reopen Japan under conditions, of course, instead of keeping this new form of, I would call it a sakoku. Michael, thank you very much for being our guest today. You have your chance to say something, introduction, and then we will have a question and answer from the floor and from online, because we are also online to that extent, whoever is listening us on Vimeo. If you have questions, you can send them through the email news@fccj.or.jp. We are ready to receive it and to ask questions on your behalf. Thank you. Michael, your turn.
You allow me to take off the mask. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and honor to speak on such an important topic on behalf of the European Business Council in Japan. Yes, what I would like to do is give you a sort of very high-level comparison about the measures introduced in Europe and the measures introduced here in Japan. A top-level comparison in order to be able to identify some important differences, if there are any. And then in the second part, I would like to discuss about the relevance and about the impact of the differences on the European business here in Japan. And then, as Pio mentioned, I will be happy to take any questions from the floor. The EU Commission has played an extremely important role in Europe regarding the travel measures. It has issued a recommendation on the 16th of March that was basically followed by most of the countries. On the 17th of March, the EU countries plus some of the countries from the EFTA have agreed on following those measures. And what were the measures? Well, regarding traveling, EU citizens and the citizens of the entire Schengen area, actually we are talking here about 30 countries around, were allowed to travel into the EU. So, if, for example, EU citizen was based here in Japan, he was able to come back without major problems. Then the EU, or actually the 30 countries that I have mentioned, have treated in the same way long-term residents or holders of permanent residency in the EU. So in the same way as EU citizens. Finally, a third criteria was that essential workers were also permitted to travel into the EU. And there is a definition issued by the EU Commission regarding who are the essential workers. So we have healthcare professionals, frontier workers, even seasonal workers in agriculture, which is very interesting. So the EU found that this is a very important industry and that we need foreigners to be able to enter the EU in order to travel, in order to work in the agriculture business. So, I would like to compare this with Japan. So, Japan mainly doesn't make any difference from the EU or from the 30 countries that I mentioned regarding their own citizens. So the Japanese basically can enter, can return to Japan. And interestingly, from some of the European airlines, I received the information that during April and May, 32,000 Japanese entered Japan. I can't say if it's a lot or not. 32,000 seems quite a substantive amount, quite a substantive number, but I don't know what was in the previous year, if we had 3 million or whatever, I don't know that. So I wouldn't make any comments regarding this number. To me, it sounds substantial. Then, foreigners without a valid re-entry permit were not allowed to enter Japan, or are still not allowed to enter Japan, regardless of the type of visa. That means basically that even residents here with permanent residency or even long-term residents, they are not allowed to come back to Japan unless there are some special circumstances. And special circumstances we know since, I believe, 10 days ago, the Ministry of Justice has issued a statement that provides us with a couple of examples of special circumstances. Comparing this to essential workers that we know from the EU, we see that essential workers, as I mentioned before, covering also some seasonal workers in the agriculture. Here on the Japanese side, we see a very, very narrow space. So special circumstances means basically some health-related issues in abroad, funeral of relatives, and so on. So we do not see anything related to business, and this is important. So the differences are, we see a very narrow scope of special circumstances as compared to the essential workers. This is the first one. And second, and this is also a very important one, is the fact that whereas the EU, or actually the 30 countries, let in permanent residents and long-term residents back or enter the EU, whereas Japan says basically no, unless special circumstances that we know are very narrow. And don't get me wrong, I think Japan has done an absolutely fantastic job, or the results are fantastic regarding the containing the spread of the virus. I have been here now 7 years in Japan, and I personally do not know anybody who got infected and showed any sort of symptoms. And we see also numbers that are fairly low. I have to say on behalf also of the European business community that nobody really relies on the numbers that are published in the media, but they are surprisingly low. And I think, in fact, the spread of the virus is contained in a very good manner. Regarding the containing of the virus and the spread of the virus, I have heard from the European business community one issue that relates to the tests. So apparently Japanese government doesn't test enough, or Japanese hospitals do not test enough. But what is more important, there are not enough tests, and it is not accessible for everyone. If I wanted to do a test, it's a very burdensome, whereas in Europe, it's pretty easy to obtain and to do such test. Now, what are the concerns of the European business regarding the Japanese travel ban? The European community has been impacted heavily by the travel ban. And we know that since February last year, we have an economic partnership agreement between the EU and Japan, a very, very important achievement that has increased the exports from the EU by 6.6% during the first year after the enactment. So it has had a very positive impact on the European business. And now what we see is actually losing the momentum because of the travel ban. We see that Japanese citizens and European citizens based here in Japan with permanent residency, with long-term stay, are treated in a different way. It is not really well understood by the business community. Why is such a different treatment between the EU citizens with permanent residency here in Japan treated different way than Japanese citizens? I heard some voices that the strain of the virus in Europe is apparently much stronger than here in Japan, and so as a measure of prevention that the strong European virus comes here to Japan, Japanese government has imposed this type of restriction. But we know the Japanese businessmen are traveling to Japan. They are traveling to Japan. I mentioned the number of 32,000 in the April and May. And I believe that even Japanese businessmen, Japanese citizens can bring, if there is, in fact, such a stronger strain of the virus to Japan. So this doesn't appear to make sense to the European business here. Further, the impact of that on European business here is that European companies with their Asia-Pacific headquarters in Japan are also losing competitiveness compared with the Japanese company. I heard also from an important cosmetic manufacturer that the executives, European executives based here in Japan cannot travel to Europe with their customers or to meet customers in Europe, whereas, for instance, their counterparts from Japanese companies can just get into the plane and fly back to Europe. So there could be also some loss of competitiveness for European businesses that has been complained about. Now, I also would like to mention, lifting the restrictions doesn't mean immediately that all Europeans based here in Japan will start immediately traveling to Europe. The EBC has conducted at the very beginning of the outbreak in the first half of March a survey that was responded by 260 members of the European Chambers of Commerce, and according to the survey, 82% of companies have implemented some measures regarding the virus, the spread of the virus, in order to protect their employees and business people, and 76% of the same companies have actually issued some travel restrictions on their own employees. So what I want to say by that is that European companies have already anticipated this from the very beginning. Means reopening for business travelers doesn't mean that they would start immediately to travel. Then we need to keep in mind that Japan has approximately 2% of foreigners with permanent residency or long-term foreigners out of all the living people here in Japan. 2%. So we're talking about only 2% that are relevant for that are actually impacted by the travel restrictions. And now the travel restrictions do not only impact the European business. On behalf of the European business, we see that the travel restrictions or the travel ban has also an impact on the Japanese business. And I would like to mention, for instance, the efforts of the JETRO to increase foreign direct investment into Japan, and Europe has been playing a very important role since as of 2018, I believe, according to JETRO, 49.5% of the foreign direct investments into Japan are from Europe. Netherlands, France, UK, Switzerland and Germany and Luxembourg are the top countries from Europe investing into Japan. So travel restriction may have an impact on that. So the work that Mr. Sasaki, the chairman of JETRO, and before him Mr. Ishige have done to increase the foreign direct investments may be at danger. We also hear from the German business community, and to give you some numbers, the German companies, there are 12,500 German companies around that are involved in business with Japan, that are exporting to Japan. 450 have their own subsidiaries here. And the German Chamber of Commerce has also conducted a survey just at the beginning of June, so 3 months later after the EBC survey. And according to that survey, 78% of the German companies here in Japan are impacted by the travel ban. Out of this 78%, 39% see loss of revenue. And out of the same 78%, 27% are expecting some additional compensation from the Japanese government to compensate the losses caused by the travel ban. Now, also according to some voices from the European business community, this could result in the fact that some companies that have headquarters for Asia Pacific here in Japan may start thinking to switch the headquarters to other countries. Businessmen who are based here, they cannot go to Korea, they cannot travel to Singapore, and are pretty much restricted in what they are doing. Further, also, the restriction appear not really well founded, and some of the European business are afraid. They are afraid that new restrictions can be imposed in an arbitrary way in the future. Well, I don't want to complain only. I think critics should be also constructive. And after consulting with the European business here in Japan, a possible solution could be that permanent and long-term residents should be immediately let out and back again into Japan. In a second step, the restriction could be lifted on business travelers, and later in a third step regarding tourists. And as a measure, you know, Japan is lucky compared to Europe, being an island. In Europe, Our natural borders are rivers, mountains, forests, fields, easy to cross. Japan is an island, and the control of entries is much easier. Partnering up with airlines could be possible way how to control the entry. The controls could already start in the airport of departure. So there are ways to find a solution for this, instead of imposing travel ban on basically all business people. So, summing up everything, I think we see from the European business perspective an unequal treatment, lack of reciprocity. This unequal treatment and lack of reciprocity not only has an impact on the European business here in Japan, but we see also that it has an impact on the Japanese business. For instance, I have heard of one example from an Austrian company that deals with the security of Shinkansen. Engineers from Europe are now not able to enter Japan to perform some work that is related to the security of Japanese Shinkansen. Therefore, the European business requests an immediate reopening for permanent residents and long-term residents, the same way as it is possible currently in Europe. In the second step, as I mentioned before, reopening for business people. Airlines can help controlling the entries, and finally, as a last step, the reopening for tourists. Bio, thank you very much. I'm open for questions from your side.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, we know, for example, that other countries close to Japan, like Korea, has established already since weeks this pre-departure registering, so that you start from Europe, and once you arrive in Korea, you've got already a team ready there that tests you and manages the situation accordingly. So we see no reason why Japan couldn't do this. Okay, before starting the question from the floor and from online, may I ask you if, as European Business Council, have you already, I guess yes, had some official formal meetings with the Japanese authorities, and which one, and what was their reaction? You mentioned before what are your requests, but did you actually discuss this alone or with the European delegation, individually European embassies, and what is the reaction that you got until now from the Japanese authorities? As far as you can tell us, I guess there is a lot of undergoing.
As much as I would have loved to have in-person meetings, and unfortunately, due to stay home, in-person meetings were not allowed. The European Business Council, as I said, has conducted first in the first half of March a survey to collect data from the European companies, and we have issued a statement to the Japanese ministers, to Keidanren, on the 12th of May. We have issued a statement on the 12th of May. We are also aware that discussions are ongoing on all different levels, and I have to give great credit here to the EU delegation here, who has basically worked closely with us, but also worked closely with the European embassies here, and actually has been in close contact with the ministries, discussing on top levels. I'm also aware that the President of the EU Commission, Ms. van der Leyen, has mentioned this issue even with President Abe.
Thank you. Okay. Are there any questions from the floor here? Otherwise, I have already. Please go to the microphone and state your name and affiliation if you have one. You can take it off.
Take it off. Just,
sure.
My name is Magda Osumi from the Japan Times, and I wanted to ask you a question about prioritizing businesses. Like, as you know, you said that you would urge the government to allow all permanent residents and long-term residents in. But the government is talking about easing these restrictions with priority given to business people. And we don't really know any details because those announcements have been really vague. And we hear that among those people may include even trainees, technical trainees, because Japan needs them. But so my question is, why do you think that it's also important for the government to allow permanent and long-term residents? Do you think that among those people, many of them are involved in businesses? And that would appeal to the government to allow those people in, because the government is saying that we are actually planning to allow business people in the first place.
Thank you. Yes, my understanding of how immigration is structured here. I said before we have only 2%. I mean, 2% of the population in Japan are foreigners with permanent and long-term residence here in Japan. So permanent long-term residence would imply that, because how the immigration laws are made, would imply that these people are in business, and we could assume that they are involved in business and not just, being here for leisure or yeah, so this is a presumption that I'm making. And in view of the fact that the number is so small, I wouldn't really distinguish within the business people what is more relevant than the others. I think the trainees, technical trainees, are probably as much important as probably CEOs, because Japan needs those people. I'm also aware of several, beside the Shinkansen example that I mentioned before, I'm aware of a couple of European companies that are waiting for their workers. They are waiting for their engineers to come here. And of course, these engineers do not have a permanent or long-term residence here in Japan. They are coming to perform the work in order to make sure that the factories continue going and that business works well. I mean, we all have been impacted here by the coronavirus, all businesses. And I feel that the travel ban is impacting unreasonably in an additional way. That's right. And so distinguishing within the businesses, I mentioned before, I suggested opening in 3 steps. Long-term and permanent residents, assuming that these people are already involved in business. Second step, business people coming from Japan, coming from Europe. Within this range, we know that the European Commission has made some distinctions. Actually, from the 1st of July, they will allow third country nationals traveling for purpose of study. So they are also opening for students. And in addition to that, highly qualified third country workers. I think the same could be seen here in Japan. And again, the proportion of the numbers of foreigners that we have in Europe and we have in Japan are so different that probably we would not need to distinguish within that range.
Can I have one more additional question?
Sure.
The government is planning is saying that in the first stage they will start letting people from Vietnam, Australia, New Zealand and Thailand in. And what do you think about this selection of countries, and how is there any real risk or the possibility that if Europe will come after that? Do you think that some businesses European businesses will withdraw? I'm asking about the timeline. We know that these restrictions won't be eased by probably the end of summer. So as long as it's in place, it may, of course, have a tremendous impact. So what do you think about this timeline and the selection of this and priority and Europe being like put after that?
Of course, it's very sad on behalf of the European business that it's not Europe in first place. At the same time, I understand that possibly Japan is picking a couple of countries that has a very low infection rate, so that's understandable to me. However, these are not the main business players for Japan. I mean, Thailand, Vietnam, they have managed excellently the spread of coronavirus. New Zealand, Australia, the same. But these are not the first. I mentioned before, 49.5% of the foreign direct investments come from Europe. France, Germany, UK, Holland, and so on. They are big players, and I think, of course, on behalf of the European business, I would like to see those to be prioritized and not other countries that have, I say, no relation to Europe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I pick up this chance, just seems to be a kind of follow-up from former member of ABC, actually, Francesco Formigoni, who works for Diesel in Osaka now. He's sending in this question, which is related probably. Why do you think Japanese government considers appropriate and socially acceptable to differentiate re-entry procedures based on nationality and permanent residency status? After all, permanent residents do pay the same amount of taxes of Japanese nationals. Don't you think such a discrimination could eventually bring to the definite cancellation of the Tokyo Olympic Games? That's an interesting question. I don't know what you think about the Olympics, but you can have your chance to state it.
Thank you, Björn. It's a delicate question. I cannot. Unfortunately, I don't have the crystal ball to say what will happen. I'm aware that there is unequal treatment. I don't want to use the word discrimination, and of course I'm paying also taxes here in Japan. I cannot leave Japan, but I know it. So the Japanese government made it that way that people who have left before the 2nd of April have still can return. People who are aware of the measures now, they are taking risk while leaving. I'm not, as I mentioned before, European business is not happy about that because they would like to be free, to some extent free, like their Japanese counterparts. They would like to be able to leave and then come back and keep business up, but they cannot. What impact this may have on the Olympics? The Olympics are also related to business. They have some major sponsors that may, I don't want to say what they will decide, but they may rethink whether they want to support the Olympics in Japan or not. I said also that some European companies feel that they are losing competitiveness currently compared to Japanese companies due to the fact how the crisis has been handled here, or actually not the crisis, but the travel ban has been handled here. I don't know if this answered the question. I hope so. If you feel that I didn't answer, I try to escape.
No, of course not. But you are not a politician, so you can risk just a hypothesis. As a human being, as a businessman here in Japan, what do you think? Are the Olympics gonna be held at all?
I rather prefer not to answer that question before the cameras.
Okay, let's go. Is there any other question here from the floor? Please.
My name is Andre Zimmermann from the Swiss Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thank you very much for the elaboration so far. For me, basically, Japan is not only an island, but it's also a very insular mindset. So obviously, it's very difficult maybe for the Japanese government to collaborate with foreign governments. My question is, why does, with the correct sense of urgency, actually entice the Japanese entities, political entities or say governmental entities, to actually discuss this issue, this pandemic, which is global, so borderless, with other governments and find solutions which basically work for the whole world? So here there is no border, there is no discrimination between businesses or people or status, so obviously it needs a global collaboration and finding a global solution.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. Unfortunately, I cannot speak on behalf of the Japanese government while this is not the case. I can reassure you that the European side has done a lot, and to get the statement that was released on the 12th of June, which basically provides the community with a couple of examples who will be let in back in Japan. It took a lot of time to get there. And the EU delegation that had a lead on that, talking with the Japanese government, has done a great job and put a lot of efforts to that in order to achieve that. It's a very small achievement. If we see what the scope is, if we see the examples in that statement of 12th of June, it doesn't really satisfy, but it was a big step on there. And why does the Japanese government not work with other governments in the Asia Pacific? I cannot answer that, unfortunately.
Does the EU actually approach the Japanese government in that respect to collaborate on these issues from outside in?
I'm not aware of that. I'm sorry, I'm not aware of the discussions between the...
Well, I am.
Please.
Yes, there are a lot of instances that the European delegation have taken up with. Yeah, but of course I cannot speak on behalf of them, but as far as there have been, there have been. I would follow up on the Swiss channel here, because we have another question from a Swiss gentleman, the first secretary of the embassy, Fabien Clerc. He's asking you, what about if EU allows Japanese tourists, talking about tourists now, enter again, how likely or unlikely is Japan going to reciprocate on this one? Or will EU fix this as a precondition?
Again,
that's another question that you...
I would love to have my crystal ball here to say what will happen. Of course, tourism is a difficult topic. Tourism is an important industry. We know also that Japanese government has worked very, very hard to increase the tourism here in Japan. And the numbers were fantastic as of last year. We know that. And all these efforts, again, we can hopefully don't need to compare this to the foreign direct investments ever, but all these numbers are gone now. And how it will develop, I do not know, and I don't believe now that the Japanese government would reciprocate the fact if the EU opens to tourists. I don't think so. Seeing how it was handled so far, I don't think so, Fabien.
Okay. Sorry. Go ahead. Yes.
My name is Kurt Sieber. I'm an associate member here, and also I'm a permanent resident actually for more than 40 years. when we made the application for the permanent resident, the overall basic policy of the government was that you get exactly the same rights to do in Japan whatever Japanese can do, with one exception, and that you are not allowed to vote. Whatever name we give to it, discrimination or not, I think the government should really seriously consider this situation once more, because although the foreign companies, the foreign population is only something like 2% there are quite a lot of permanent residents who are in leading positions. I'm retired now, so for me it's less of a problem. So, but being in business or in business management here in Japan for 30 years, let's say for a foreign company, Swiss company, by the way, just Switzerland is part of the 30 countries you mentioned, of course, yes. The normal standard would be, and that's one side of the coin, is that as a general manager or president of the Japanese subsidiary, you would have to go at least once or twice a year to discuss with the people in your headquarters. And on the other side, and that's the other part of the problem, is the people from the headquarters, since they consider Japan to be a very important country or a very important subsidiary, they want to come here at least once or, well, some of them 3 or 4 times, but I would say at least twice a year to come here to discuss the policies between the headquarters and the local subsidiary. And communication, as we all know who have been in Japan, communication, because some of the thinking in Japan and some of the thinking in Europe is not necessarily...
Question, please.
Yeah, okay. So my question to you is, I mean, what can we do? I mean, you said, I hear that EU is doing quite a lot, but I think one of the big jobs of the European Business Council is to assist the EU with these actual problems which the business community is presently facing here in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have been active on this issue. EU has been active on this issue. What more we can do, and we are now considering, in view of the examples that we have received from the European business community and beyond, to prepare another statement. And we are also considering to partner up with other organizations such as the American Chamber of Commerce. So we have organized, as the European Business Council, last Friday, a joint webinar where we had also the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Lafleur, on the panel, just to discuss these issues. And we are in the phase of still collecting information, and we are certainly considering to issue another statement. Yes, I fully understand your position, and I'm in the same position. I'm not a permanent resident here, but I would say I'm, at least in the European terms, I'm a long-term resident, since I have been here more than 5 years. And I find it very regrettable that permanent residents and long-term residents cannot have the same rights, at least regarding traveling, as as the Japanese have. And yeah, you corrected me that the number of foreigners is larger than 2% here. That's right. I believe we are at 2.4%. So mentioning before 2%, I referred only to the permanent and long-term residents. So this is what, according to my calculations, we come up with to 2% very precisely. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions from the online, so go ahead. Yes?
Thank you very much. I'm Mariko Sato from NHK. I have two questions. For the first question is about why do you think the EU, you mentioned about the difference between EU's, for the border control, the restrictions for the EU and the Japanese side, but why do you think the EU can accept those residents from the people, or business people from Japan? I mean, is it just the EU countries are enough capacity for testing, or what is the difference between EU, Europe countries and Japan? Japan's Japan. That's the first question, and for the second question is about you mentioned about the headquarters thing. Some companies might switch the headquarters to other countries, but for which countries those you are aiming to? Those companies are aiming to, and what's the difference between those countries and Japan? Thank you.
Thank you very much. HQ. So why can the EU countries, or actually the 30 countries that I mentioned before, so beyond the EU, accept, let's say, more foreigners entering the EU? I think one important point is that actually in Europe, because of the borders that we have, the percentage of foreigners is much higher. So they are more involved in some substantial work in Europe. So we need them. That's one point. The other point I would say, in Europe, probably we are ready to take a little bit more risk, controlled risk, I say, than Japan. That's the first question. The second question regarding the headquarters, I don't have any specific example where a European company or European company with Asia-Pacific headquarter is already considering, for instance, and this is purely a hypothesis or example, switching the headquarters to Singapore or Korea or any other, Vietnam, or I don't have any specific examples. But I think why we have Asia-Pacific headquarters of European companies here in Japan is due to the stability, the security of the system. It's a good system, I would say, and as I said, JETRO has done a fantastic job promoting Japan in this regard, and now the travel ban is something that the European companies have a hard time to understand. As I said, there is no evidences that in Europe we have a stronger strain of the coronavirus. So there, from the European perspective, there are actually no reasons for such a strict travel ban as we are seeing here. So this results in the fact that some companies may think that Japan is sort of unpredictable in this respect. So even if once the travel ban is lifted, it may come again. And so this is probably a concern that European companies may have. So it may come arbitrarily again.
Okay.
Hi, Ryotaro Nakamaru from Kyoto News. Thanks for the talk today. This question is closely related to the previous question. I've seen the word Japan risk being used to describe Japan risk, be used to describe the government's lack of consideration for foreign companies and the foreign population in Japan. How do you think this kind of lack of consideration might impact the government's push to have more foreign workers enter Japan to replace the aging workforce? I know they're trying to get more people, especially from Southeast Asia, to come into Japan, but they might not find it as good an option if they know that they're going to find these difficulties when they come here.
Thank you very much. I think probably, employees or people have probably a little bit shorter memories than companies. I think companies will remember longer what happened, and this may have probably a more severe impact on the companies than on let's say workers from foreign countries. For instance, if I am based in Europe, or if I am based in Southeast Asia, and I get let's say a good offer from a Japanese company here based here in Japan, I would probably still travel to Japan and be willing to work here, despite the fact that I may remember, there was a travel ban in 2020, and this could happen again. So I think that for the companies, it may have a more significant impact than for single travelers. Of course, needless to say that it is counterproductive. On one hand, we are asking skilled workers to come over, and now we are saying, no, please stop, stay where you are. So I think we are losing a couple of months of getting qualified people to Japan, and we will have to catch up with that. I'm saying we on behalf actually of Japan.
I have three at least questions from online. The first one is by Ilgin Yorulmaz, who's a member of our Professional Activities Committee. She's asking you, do the EBC efforts to have Japanese government relax travel ban and re-entry restrictions include the so-called 5-year work permit holders like you, I guess, suspect, not for just long-term residents and permanent residents? Second question, does this include also dependents and their other people overseas who have had to return to seek refuge in Japan when their schools closed outside Japan? And last, I don't know if you are entitled to answer this because now UK is not anymore member of European, but the last question is, what about UK citizens?
So, as for the, you may have to help me again with the questions.
Yeah.
I was not making notes, but as for the first question regarding the
at the beginning you said that permanent and long term.
That's right. That's right.
Should we or should you officially include also the just 5 years or 3 years? All those people that have a long.
It would be nice if we had just a menu. We could say like, hey, let's order this and this and this. It's not like that. As I said, it took a long time to just have a statement from the Japanese government what they understand under the special circumstances. So we have a couple of examples. Now we know who would be allowed to come in. Now, if I refer to the situation in Europe we have the term of permanent and long-term residents, and long-term residence is defined as 5 or more years. So can we ask for something like that here? I think we would be happy if already permanent residents and long-term residents would be allowed to come to re-enter Japan. This would be a great achievement. Of course, we want more, and we would like also that any business person is related. That any business person is allowed to come back to Japan, but this is something to wish for, I believe.
What about UK citizens?
UK citizens, within the EU, they are still treated like they were a part of the EU. EU is geographically it is Europe, so I wouldn't see why. For instance, EU, strictly speaking, or let's say the 30 countries that I have mentioned before, should be treated in a different way, logically in a different way than UK.
Okay. Well, everybody knows that when we talk about special circumstances, we all, Japan Times did a story on that, the Brazilian soccer player that was especially allowed back to Japan. Well, Brazil, as everybody knows, is the second most dangerous country right now. So special circumstances means a lot and everything. Now, the last two questions. One is from our associate member, John Anderson. She's asking something very, very to the point. I don't know if you are able to answer that, but let me fire the question. According to the Ministry of Justice website, the grounds used for denying foreigners entry to Japan in the current situation is the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act, denial of landing paragraph. Article 5 says, a foreign national who falls under any of the following items is denied permission to land in Japan. And these conditions being a person whom the Ministry of Justice has reasonable grounds to believe it is likely to commit an act which could be detrimental to the interest or public security of Japan. What I believe John wants to say is that there is by no way officially stated the COVID or the pandemic reason. It goes under this paragraph. Has the EBC, to your knowledge, questioned how this paragraph could possibly be considered to apply to those with permanent residence and long-term residence? Because this seems to me an issue of human rights and discrimination.
Yeah, it would be difficult here now to interpret actually Japanese law. I think the statements that are available, and I'm not referring to the laws, the statements that are available on the website of the Ministry of Justice say clearly that permanent residents, that foreigners are not allowed to re-enter unless there are special circumstances. And so I'm not here to argue with the Japanese government about the interpretation of the article that you have just referred to. We take what we get, but we certainly are asking that there is an equal treatment with the Japanese citizens, and that there is a reciprocity with the EU or with the 30 countries mentioned before.
Okay, now the last question comes from Richard Solomon, editor-in-chief of Beacon Reports. And it's a question very point to, I believe, because you are a lawyer, right?
I am.
Okay. Can you please tell us a little bit more about possible compensation for damage caused by unequal treatment against foreign business and subsidiaries in Japan as regard of the travel ban? Has the EBC any role in taking and representing such European firms? Let me add, I'm sure that some of the colleagues are aware of that a few years ago in America, there was a very interesting case of a foreign citizen that had the so-called, how do you call it, the green card? Yeah, the green card, and was not allowed for reasons that now I don't remember very well. And he sued the United States because the green card entitles the right of residence. And I believe you are a lawyer, you can confirm this or not, that having been granted a permanent residence or a long-term residence, as the gentleman also said before, brings you very close, if not totally equal, to a Japanese citizen. So you have a right to stay in this country, or not?
That's right. You have a right to stay in the country, certainly. As I tried to say before, it's not that Japan says you have to get out. They say if you get out, you may not come back. That's what they say. And they treat in a different way those who left before the 2nd of April and those who left or will leave after the 2nd of April. So that's
in your opinion, is legally acceptable?
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. You asked about damages. Actually, the gentleman asked about damages. I think it's very challenging to calculate damages in general. We will have to show that there is a loss due to a certain action taken. But what we have in this specific case is actually a legal foundation for this travel ban, and this will make it very difficult to take any action against the government for damages, because we have a legal foundation for that.
Well, thank you very much. If there are no other questions, I would wrap up. Thank you, Michael, for being with us. I hope that you will help out and solve this solution very close, because we don't like to feel like hostages here. Thank you.
Thank you, Pio. Thank you.